In my last video, I talked about the downside of pretty privilege, but I saw one comment kept coming back, not always word for word, but the idea was the same. Sure, pretty privilege has downsides, but it's still better than being ugly. Nobody wants to be ugly, and nobody ever talks about what ugly people go through. Well, I have to say, that's a fair point. It's not something you can brush off with, well, beauty is subjective. And move on. It deserves a real answer. So, let's start with the question underneath it. What does ugly even mean? Who decided that? What is the standard? Because here is what's interesting. If the answer changes depending on the century, the country, or even the decade you happen to live in, then maybe ugly was never an objective fact in the first place. And maybe the real issue was never pretty versus ugly. Maybe the real issue is who is holding the measuring stick and why? That is the question this entire video is trying to answer. And to get there, we have to go back a little further than you might expect. Not to who is deciding what is beautiful today, but to a much more basic question. Was ugly ever a fixed fact to begin with? Okay everyone, just very quick commercial break, and this video is not sponsored, but I just want to let you know that my husband has a bartending service called KBS, Kevin Bartending Service. If you're from Southern California and you need professional bartender, server, bar setup, and event support for weddings, private parties, and corporate events, please consider checking us out. I will leave the website link below. If you need stuff for your event, just go to the website and leave a request. I would really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Now let's get back to the video. But before we go any further, there is something even more fundamental we need to figure out. When people talk about beauty, are we talking about an objective fact? Something science can measure the same way it measures gravity or the boiling point of water? The answer is sort of. Psychologists have found new patterns in how people respond to faces. One of the most well-known is facial symmetry. On average, people tend to rate more symmetrical faces as more attractive. Another is something called averageness. Back in the early 1990s, researchers digitally blended lots of different faces into a single composite image. Surprisingly, people often prefer that blended face over most of the individual faces it came from. So why did this happen? Researchers generally think there are two reasons, and they are probably both playing a role. The first comes from evolutionary psychology. The idea is that a face that is closer to the average may reflect fewer disruption during development. In other words, a body that grew the way it was supposed to. On average, that can be associated with better genetic health. The second explanation is a cognitive theory, sometimes called processing fluency. Basically, your brain is constantly building a mental reference point from all the faces you have seen throughout your life. So when you come across a face that is closer to that internal average, it's quicker and easier for your brain to recognize. That feeling of familiarity and ease can end up being experienced as attractiveness. Today, most researchers don't see these two explanations as competing with each other. If anything, they probably work together. And then there's a famous golden ratio, the idea that the perfect face follows a specific mathematical formula. It sounds convincing, and you will see it everywhere online, especially in beauty content. But in the scientific community, this evidence just isn't that strong. It's still a debated idea, and it has far more support in marketing than it does in peer-reviewed research. But here is the part that really matters. Even the strongest findings, things like symmetry or averageness, aren't proving that beauty exists as some universal law of nature. What they are really showing is how human beings tend to react to certain faces. And once you accept that what we are actually measuring is reaction, not truth, the next question becomes obvious. Has that reaction always looked the same? The answer is, it hasn't, and history hands you the proof directly. If you know where to look. In ancient Europe, a high, broad forehead was considered the high of feminine beauty and intelligence. Women who weren't born with one plucked their hairline, sometimes hair by hair, all the way back toward the crown of the head, just to fake the look. The Italian writer Agnolo Firenzuola, I'm sorry if I mispronounce his name, even wrote in his treatise on female beauty that an ideal forehead should take up roughly a third of the entire face. Think about that for a second. Compared to what gets called an attractive forehead today, I think it's almost the complete opposite. Tang Dynasty China, around full face was the beauty idea of the era because it was associated with health, prosperity, and high social status. In a world where food wasn't guaranteed, looking well fed was something to admire. One of the most famous beauty of the era, Yang Wu face, was celebrated precisely because of her fuller, rounder features. Fast forward to today, and in many parts of East Asia, the dominant idea has shifted dramatically. Now it's the opposite. A slim, sharply defined jawline, what's commonly called a V-like face. Then we have Victorian England. Pale, almost translucent skin was the standard, so intensely, in fact, that some women use lead or arsenic-based powder to whiten their faces, despite knowing that those products could seriously harm them. Paleness wasn't just an aesthetic preference, it was a status signal. It showed that you didn't have to work outside in the sun, which usually meant you came for money. Now just step back and look at the bigger picture. Same pieces, same human face, three completely different ideas of what counted as beautiful. And honestly, if I compare myself to the three era I just mentioned, I would probably consider ugly in the three era. And the people living in each of those time periods didn't think they were following an arbitrary trend. Their standard felt just as obvious, just as natural, and just as correct as ours do today. Now, before anyone gets the wrong idea, I want to make one thing clear. I'm not saying that beauty standards aren't real or that they don't have real ethics, because they absolutely do. And in the world we are living in right now, yes, the closer you are to the current ideal, the more advantages you are likely to have. Nothing I'm saying here changes it. What history tells us isn't that those advantages are imaginary, it's that the idea itself isn't permanent. It isn't some law of nature that's always existed and always will. It's a reflection of one particular place and one particular moment in time, one version of beauty that happens to be in fashion right now. And I think that is an important distinction. Realizing that doesn't make today's beauty standard any less influential. It doesn't suddenly erase beauty privilege. What it does do, it reminds us to see those standards for what they are, something created by people, shaped by culture, and capable of changing, just like they always have. So maybe they deserve a little less unquestioning devotion and a little more perspective before we decide they are worth sacrificing everything for. So far, we have been looking back at history, but this isn't just a history lesson because the same conversation is happening right now. Think about someone who looks in the mirror and says, I'm just average, or worse, I'm ugly. But what are they actually comparing themselves to? Average to what? And ugly to what? Increasingly, the honest answer isn't the people they pass on the street every day. It's its narrow, curated sample. It's celebrities, it's professional models, it's influencers, and now, more than ever, it's faces that have been filtered, edited, retouched, and sometimes even generated by AI. In other words, the comparison isn't happening against real life anymore. It's happening against a carefully curated highlight reel. And that didn't happen by accident. The version of beauty we are constantly comparing ourselves to is being selected, amplified, and pushed in front of us for a reason, which brings us to the next part of the story. If part 1 showed that ideas of beauty aren't fixed, that they change across cultures and across time, then the next question is, what is driving those changes today? Who or what is shaping the standard we are all measuring ourselves against? Because beauty standards don't just appear out of nowhere. In the Renaissance, the ideas mostly came from things like aristocratic culture, paintings, and poetry. Today, the machinery behind them is far bigger and far more sophisticated and far easier to measure. Let's start with the most obvious one, the beauty industry. The global beauty and personal care industry was worth around $646 billion in 2024 and is expected to keep growing over the next several years. That's definitely not some tiny niche market. It's one of the biggest consumer industry in the world. Now think about what that actually means. An industry that size can survive if everyone suddenly wakes up one morning, looks in the mirror and thinks, you know what? I'm happy with how I look. I don't really need anything else. Because if that happened, a huge part of the market would disappear. That is why the goal isn't to let the gap between who you are and who you are supposed to be completely disappear. The gap has to stay open. Not because there's some secret group controlling beauty standards, but because businesses make money by selling solutions. And to keep selling solutions, there always has to be another problem to solve, another flaw to notice, another trend to chase, another product that promises to get you one step closer to the ideal version of yourself. And if you have been online at all over the past decade, you have probably watched that cycle happen in real time. 1 year is full coverage makeup, then it's glass skin, then it's a clean girl aesthetic, then it's a different eyebrow shape, a different lip shape, a different hairstyle. The details keep changing, but the patterns stay exactly the same. The second force is social media, and despite how it often feels, social media isn't a neutral window to the world. Every major platform is designed around one goal: keeping your attention for as long as possible. The longer you stay, the more ads you see, and the more money the platform makes. So the algorithm learns to show you whatever keeps people watching. And guess what? Over time, certain faces, certain features, and certain aesthetics constantly perform better than others. They'll both get pushed to more people, which means you see them even more often. And after a while, well, something subtle starts to happen. What was once just popular begins to feel normal. It starts to look like that's simply what people are supposed to look like. And this isn't just speculation. We have a real example of a platform doing something very close to this on purpose. And prepare yourself, because when I was researching this, I was shocked too. Keep in mind that this happened in 2020, which is 6 years ago, but I think it's very worth talking about. In 2020, the investigative news outlet The Intercept obtained internal TikTok moderator documents. According to those documents, moderators were instructed to reduce the visibility of videos from users described in the guideline as having ugly facial looks, an abnormal body shape, too many wrinkles, or filming in what the company considers shabby surroundings. The stated goal was to make the app's recommendation feed look more aspirational for new users. TikTok later said the policy was no longer being used and described it as an early, poorly designed attempt to reduce bullying. Whatever the original intention was, think about what the policy actually did. For a period of time, one of the world's biggest social media platforms was quietly deciding which faces were more likely to be seen and which ones wasn't. Not because the people had broken any rules, not because they had done anything wrong, simply because they didn't fit the image the platform wanted to present. That is a very different thing from simply reflecting beauty standards. It helps to create them. And when hundreds of millions of people, many of them teenagers and young adults, are using that platform every day, that influence becomes incredibly powerful. And there is another example that shows just how far this can go. It is called Snapchat dysmorphia. The term first appeared in a 2018 paper published in JAMA Facial Plastic Surgery. Doctors started noticing something that hadn't really happened before. Instead of bringing in photos of celebrity and saying, "I want to look like them," patients were showing up with filter selfie of themselves, not someone else's face, their own, just the version that had been smoothed, reshaped, and digitally perfected by an app. And they wanted surgeons to make that version permanent. By 2021, an annual survey by the American Academy of Facial Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery found that 79% of facial plastic surgeons said patients were asking for procedures to look better in selfies, a dramatic increase from just a few years earlier. Think about how strange that is. The standard people are comparing themselves to isn't even another human being anymore. It's a version of their own face that never actually existed. The algorithm isn't simply showing you idea anymore. Sometimes it's creating one that is uniquely tailored for you and then quietly convincing you that your real face is the one falling short. The third force is actually the oldest one we have talked about, and it's existed long before social media. It is repetition. For decades, movie, television, and advertising have repeatedly shown us a fairly narrow version of what an attractive person looks like. The same types of faces, the same feature, the same general idea of beauty. And when something is repeated enough times, we stop seeing it as a choice. We start seeing it as reality. But what we are actually looking at is a result of thousands of decisions made behind the screen. Who gets cast, who gets promoted, which faces get put on magazine covers, which one gets shown as the romantic lead, the successful person, the person we are supposed to admire. Those decisions weren't random. They were shaped by specific people, specific industry, and specific incentives. Today, beauty standards aren't usually created by one person writing a poem about someone's forehead. They are created through a mix of code, commerce, and countless repeated images appearing on our screen every single day. Up until this point, we have mostly been talking about system, industry, algorithm, culture, but these systems don't just influence what people think, they can also influence the choices people make about their own body. Before we go there, there's one distinction we need to make clear. This isn't about deciding who has a good enough reason to get surgery and who doesn't. That is not the point. The point is to separate two very different things. So what I'm saying is that we need to know the difference between reconstructive surgery and cosmetic surgery. Reconstructive surgery is about restoring something affected by a medical condition, an injury, or a condition someone was born with. The goal is usually to restore function, repair damage, or bring the body closer to a medically healthy state. It is not about chasing whatever appearance happens to be popular at the moment. But on the other hand, cosmetic surgery usually involves changing a healthy body in order to alter appearance, often to move closer to a certain aesthetic idea or beauty standard. And that is the category we are focusing on in this next section. Not because cosmetic procedures are wrong, but because this is where the bigger question we have been exploring, social pressure, cultural expectation, and algorithm-driven ideas of beauty, start interacting with real decisions people make about themselves. One of the biggest changes is who's getting this procedure and how young they are getting. A 2022 survey found that 75% of facial plastic surgeons said they had seen more patients under 30 asking for cosmetic surgery or injectables. Back in 2020, nearly 230,000 cosmetic surgeries and nearly 140,000 non-invasive cosmetics procedures were performed on teens aged 13 to 19. Not skincare, not makeup, not temporary treatments, actual surgery on teenagers. Another survey found that 37% of Gen Z respondents said they are more likely to undergo cosmetic surgery due to social media, and 73% said they most often encounter cosmetic procedure content on TikTok and Instagram, the same platform where algorithms decide what gets shown, what gets repeated, and what starts to feel normal. So here's the question I want to ask you. If you say, my body, my choice, but that choice is being shaped by social media algorithm, society beauty standard, and the endless stream of advertising around you, how much of that choice is truly yours? Now, this is where the conversation gets tricky. It would be really easy to say, well, your choice isn't really yours anymore. But that doesn't quite hold up. Because technically, every human decision is shaped by environment, family, culture, the advertising you grew up surrounding by, even the language you think in. So if we argue that any outside influence automatically makes a choice not real, then no decision by anyone, ever, has been fully free, which makes the whole concept useless. I think there's a better way to look at this. Autonomy isn't something you either have or you don't. It's more like a spectrum. The real question isn't if this decision truly yours or not. It is how or where are you of what is actually driving your decisions. Imagine two people making the exact same decision to get cosmetic surgery. One has thought it through for years, understand exactly why they want it, has weighed the pros and cons, and know that they would still be okay if they didn't do it. And the other one is chasing an insecurity that slowly formed after years of scrolling through perfectly curated faces online. An insecurity they haven't even realized was planted theirs in the first place. Yes, on paper, they made the same choice, but underneath that decision, they are standing in two very different places. Now, before we move on, I know some of you might think, so are you saying skincare, makeup, or cosmetic surgery is a bad thing? No, not at all. If someone chose this old thing because they really enjoy them, because it's helped them feel more like themselves, or simply gives them more confidence and they would still be okay with who they are if they didn't do it, that is a reasonable, healthy, self-aware choice. Nothing in this video is arguing against that. The concern starts when it no longer feels like a choice, when they feel like they need to have pretty privilege to be worthy of good things in life, when their self-esteem depends on fixing one more flaw, or when the motivation isn't really excitement or self-expression anymore. At that point, the question isn't whether cosmetic surgery, makeup, or skincare is good or bad anymore. Because, as I just mentioned before, two people can make the exact same choice for completely different reasons, and sometimes it's not the decision itself that deserves a closer look, it's what's underneath it. No matter what we look like, whether we fit today's beauty standard or not, someone will always have something to say. And the uncomfortable truth is, without even realizing it, most of us have probably done the same thing to someone else. We have all, at some point, looked at another person and judged them through the very standard we are criticizing now. Pretty privilege, in some form, will probably never fully disappear from human society because it's tangled up with some things much deeper. Whether we truly respect what makes each person different, the moment someone recognizes that every person carries their own kind of beauty, not measurable against anyone else's, they stop needing to argue their way into feeling worthy. They start being able to see beauty around them, with makeup or without it, on a good day or on a bad one. That scent of worth doesn't move. And here is one thing none of us can escape. Everyone in this conversation, you, me, everyone watching, will age. Everyone will, at some point, become physically weaker than they are right now. No exception, regardless of how attractive anyone was ever considered to be. Beauty is temporary, it will change, the same way it's always had throughout history. What is left after all of that? A person, someone who is looking for the same thing the rest of us are, a life with happiness, love, and peace. So maybe that's the question I'm gonna leave you with. When you look at other people, and when you look at yourself, are you seeing more than just the surface?